I personally think that everything that's going on right now, the protests, the rallies, the marches, it's people are fighting for something that is so overdue. And I don't think that rioting and looting is like violence is never the answer. However, this injustice has gone on for far too long, and the majority of these actions that people are taking are peaceful and are sparking change. And I personally think that it's necessary in order to raise awareness and in order to actually get things done. I think it's really important for our generation to speak up about things that we see are wrong so that hopefully we can spark change and actually get things to the point that they should already be at.
And my opinion, what's going on in the protests, I think they're 100% justified. I think that we have immense problems. We did and we still have immense problems when it comes to systematic racism in our justice system, but also many other aspects of our society. And I think that's the core foundation of what Black Lives Matter is all about. It's not just, Black lives, matter, are prioritized over other lives. Obviously not. All lives definitely matter. But when blacks are disproportionately affected on all levels of society, you need to stand up and say, that is not right. And that is why Black lives do matter. My opinion, I'm totally standing in solidarity with all the protesters. In terms of like the rioting and looting and stuff, I'm kind of in a mixed bag, but mostly I am against it.
Okay, so my opinion on the current riots and protests going on is I think that they're absolutely necessary, 100%. One of the greatest foundations of our civil liberties is the ability to exercise our First Amendment rights, which is our freedom to peaceful assembly and to protest, and criticism through the outlets of media and the press and those sorts of things. However, I don't believe that the looting is constitutional or acceptable, especially with small businesses that are suffering.
So, my opinion concerning everything that's been going on. Well, as for the police brutality, I think it's absolutely terrible. Like, it's been going on for too long, and that leads me to my opinion on the protests and on the whole Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's amazing that um, that people of every race and of every background is coming together, and we're like actually trying to put an end to this. And I think it's super inspiring, and it makes me really happy that everyone is out protesting and making their voices heard.
All right. What is your experience with the police?
With the police, well, um it's a little different for me because I got to the United States about 2 years ago. So most of my life I lived in Mexico. I was born and raised in Mexico City. Police there, we like if you ask any person in Mexico City if they trust the police, they'll say no, but it's for different reasons. It's not because of like racial bias. It's more of because of corruption. Like every single cop in Mexico is corrupt, and not just like here where I believe it's the institution. There it's individual people because well, that institution, instead of being overfunded like it is here, it's underfunded. So police will do anything to get more money, individual police. And it's really like it's pretty scary. But as for police here, um I haven't had many encounters with police officers here. I I haven't had any like severe negative experiences. And I mean, I it's definitely I believe it has something to do with the privilege I get because of the color of my skin, but I haven't had anything bad happen to me. No.
My opinion on what's going on with all the protests and police brutality and riots, it's sad that there's rioting and police brutality. Um, it's a cycle of violence, really. The riots lead to more police brutality, and more police brutality leads to more riots. When you really look at it, one bad rioter at a protest can really cause a lot of trouble.
I mean, police brutality is definitely a real thing. I fully support protests, but rioting for me personally is a little too much. I feel that a lot of people on the opposing side would think that it's immature, so I feel like if you wanted to get more attention, other stuff could be brought up. But yeah, I really support the protesting, and I think police brutality is very much a real thing.
I think that it's great that these protests are happening because it's been a long time coming. Unfortunately, the current national leadership has caused tensions to be heightened.
My experience with the police is very limited, and I personally think that the experiences we should be focusing on are the ones of BIPOC with the police. So that would be Black, Indigenous, people of color, and I personally haven't been affected by favoritism or racism with the police just because I haven't really had the opportunity to engage. I haven't really had the circumstances to engage with an officer.
Yeah, my experience with the police, I am a white male, so, and live in a pretty upper middle class neighborhood, so I generally do not have a lot of problems when it comes to police since I have immense privilege. You know, my community is not over policed at all. I barely see a police car all the time. You know, compared to other communities of color, mainly poor, working class areas that have people of color, they are over policed, so they constantly live in fear. So, as for me, I'm not constantly living in fear. You know, I've never been wrongfully stopped by a police officer. I don't feel fear when I'm having with police officers. I don't have that mentality because I have that privilege to live in a good world. You know, good can be interpreted in any way, but that's just the fact. You know, Blacks have to live in fear because of the police. I don't, fortunately. You know, since my experiences with the police have been fairly fine and okay, I don't think my own experiences should dictate, you know, what police, you know, reform we need and if we even need the police at all. I think we need to be listening to the voices of the unheard. Like Martin Luther King said, we need to listen to the people who have been, you know, wrongfully unjusted. I will stand as an ally 100%, staying in solidarity with the movement, but I think we need to listen to the people who have been wrongfully accused and have been, you know, unjustly put under systematic racism for years and years and years. So I don't think my own experiences should dictate if the police are necessary. Though, you know, my own opinion is, yes, of course, the police are necessary in many aspects, but unfortunately, the power dynamics and the way of how the police works in our country is immensely different than most of the other nations of the world, and this is why we see sort of an authoritarian like approach, because they are overly funded for things like militarization. They don't have proper training and tactics, and I think that we should be, you know, defunding, you know, the police. And if you don't know what defund means, it doesn't just mean throwing the money out of nowhere. It means reinvesting that money into other sectors that, of police reform, and also reinvesting that money into minority communities that need it the most. So yeah, that's kind of what I think it needs, in terms of police. I think what needs to be changed. The whole structure, power dynamic, police unions, things like that. Things like police unions. Police unions are immensely powerful and can, change the justice system however they feel they need it to, keep their record and keep their reputation and keep all their benefits. So the power dynamics, the structure, and how the police is, structured in America is why it's been systematically racist throughout years and years and years and years and years of oppression.
So my experience with the police is very limited. I live in a pretty small town with very few police officers. The only time I've ever come into contact with police officers in a professional setting is one time this year when I got a speeding ticket from a police officer. And when my phone was stolen from a public place, I filed a complaint or a search for my phone, and I spoke to police officers about that. There were other things stolen, so it was a group of me and a couple other girls went to go talk to some officers about that. Based on my personal experience, both of those instances were very limitedly helpful with the police. I mean, my speeding ticket, I was going, I believe, 7 miles over the speed limit in a place that is notoriously a speed trap. So I guess my speeding could have put people at risk, and that you could argue that police were necessary in that instance. However, I believe it could have been dealt with in a different way. And the filing of the complaint, they never did find my phone or any of the stolen goods, so that didn't help a whole bunch either. But that's not to say that sometimes police aren't necessary, but in my experience, they have not been.
With the police, well, it's a little different for me because I got to the United States about 2 years ago. So most of my life I lived in Mexico. I was born and raised in Mexico City. Police there, we like if you ask any person in Mexico City if they trust the police, they'll say no, but it's for different reasons. It's not because of like racial bias. It's more of because of corruption. Like every single cop in Mexico is corrupt, and not just like here, where I believe it's the institution. There, it's individual people because that institution, instead of being overfunded like it is here, it's underfunded. So police will do anything to get more money, individual police, and it's really like it's pretty scary. But as for police here, I haven't had many encounters with police officers here. I haven't had any like severe negative experiences. And it's definitely, I believe it has something to do with the privilege I get because of the color of my skin. But I haven't had anything bad happen to me. No.
Um,
All right.
skip
Sorry.
yeah, I'll skip 3 and 4. I never really had an encounter with the police, so
Okay.
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What do you think? Sorry.
It's okay. It's been a while since I've done an interview like this, so yeah.
All right. What do you think needs to change in the country in terms of the police?
I've had a couple experiences. One, a gun pulled like at the side of him, so that one was not very nice. But only a couple, but most of them weren't bad. Only just that one.
What are my experiences with the police? I have no noteworthy experience with the police.
I think that a police force is necessary, but not in the way that we have it today. I believe that the police really respond with more extreme actions, and if we split up the police into sectors of specialists for mental health and for just certain things in the community that police respond to, but they could all be police. That way, it's a bit specialized, it's safer for everybody, and we don't have to worry about people responding with violence when it's unnecessary. So, like, for instance, in our community, if instead of calling 911 because of like an abusive situation, you could call a specialist who would know how to handle that situation better than a police officer. Or if you are dealing with mental health and suicide issues, you could call a different number to receive help for that specifically rather than police officers. Because I know there have been circumstances where people have called the police wanting to receive help and ended up being killed or hurt because of it, and that's just so unnecessary.
I think these changes at the police can 100% be, brought to by local level. Vote for your local candidates. Vote for every single candidate that provides progressive police reform and defunding of the police, so they can allocate certain resources into certain other things that we need in cities. So I think voting for local legislation is very, very, very key. And there's a really good saying by Killer Mike is, he doesn't vote for local prosecutors, because they've been the ones who have been tarnishing his family his entire life. So, vote for social service workers, vote for DAs, vote for people that are going to make things right. Not prosecute people for crimes that they did not commit, or, prosecute people for unjust things. Vote at your local level. It starts with that. But it also, like I said, it, ends with reallocating funds. It ends with firing certain individuals on police precincts that had a notorious history of doing unjust attempts on, people of color and, just people in general. So there's many things we need to do in terms of reforming and changing our police dynamic in this country.
In terms of the police, I think that there needs to be more of an emphasis on de-escalation of conflict as opposed to escalation, which we've seen during these protests with jumpy reactiveness on the part of some of the police officers, or unnecessary instances of further brutality. I think that civilians shouldn't be held to the same standards as police officers when in the face of danger. Police are trained to not be jumpy in the face of a potential hazard. They are supposed to de-escalate. They're not supposed to act like civilians. Don't have that training necessarily. So I think there's different standards there. And I think these de-escalation things, more an increase in workers trained in that, social workers, that kind of thing, especially for instances of like domestic abuse and things like that.
That's an interesting question. I'll say this. I think they're necessary for I think the police are necessary for like a certain, how do I explain this? I think the police are necessary for things that should be considered crimes, like an act of evil, not for things like drug problems, or problems with homeless people, problems with youth. Those are problems that the police should not have the right to handle, because that's when bad things happen. That's when, like, George Floyd was killed because he got arrested for counterfeit. Counterfeit is not something that the police should be called to handle. So I think the police is necessary to protect citizens, but they're used for so much more that is unnecessary, completely unnecessary.
Of course they're necessary. When you're in a bad situation, you're gonna call them and they're gonna help most of the time. Of course they are. I don't think all cops are bad, so yeah, definitely they're necessary.
Are the police necessary? Yeah, I think they're necessary.
I think if we just break up the police force into sectors of specialists for specific circumstances and situations in the community, people would feel a lot safer. There would be less brutality and police violence, and I think it would just be the best solution for everybody, because there is so much money and so much contribution from the government to our police forces that we could spread out to make more beneficial for the entire community.
I think these protests are very, very, very necessary to make change in the country. Many of the Black Lives Matter protests in the past have been somewhat successful, but they really haven't changed the overall human dichotomy of the issues around it. I mean, we've never seen Black Lives Matter protests this big until now, because we've had enough. We've had enough of what is happening. Especially black people. Black people have had enough. I've had enough of seeing, these type of people, die and get murdered unjustly. Black people and people of color have it the worst. They know this is why these things need to be happening. 100%. 100%. This is a very, very, very good thing that we could be doing to make fundamental systematic changes to the frameworks of our society, not even our law enforcement, but for economic means. I mean, blacks in this country have been economically depressed, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and then when they pull themselves by their bootstraps, read the 1929 Tulsa riots, they get beaten, they get bombed, they get ransacked, they get taken out everywhere, okay? So it is time for us to change all sectors of our economy when it comes to people of color, especially African Americans.
So, do I think these protests are necessary? 100%, absolutely. When anyone sees a change that they want made in the country, they are 100% guaranteed the right to protest as long as it remains peaceful. It's not to say that these protests have remained entirely peaceful for the most part, but for the most part they have. I want to say 99% of protests. I mean, there have been protests here in my small hometown that have been pretty much entirely peaceful. And I think that is the number one way to gain media attention and draw attention to issues that we find really important and that we want dealt with in America. Social media has definitely changed the playing field a bit, but I think protests are still the number one form and entirely necessary in this instance particularly.
Well, what do I think needs to change for police in the country? I think the institution needs to be defunded or rebranded completely. Like I said, I don't I don't believe many of the things police are given money for to fix. Many of the problems police are given money to fix, they're problems that don't belong to police officers. They're problems that belong to like mental health professionals, drug abuse professionals, people that know how to handle like um, what are considered right now super low stakes crimes. I don't think police should be paid to just like harass and put people in jail for minor drug possession charges. Um, so yeah, like as for what I think should change, uh, all of that funding that goes to police for like minor things needs to go into public housing, um, drug research centers, drug addiction centers, so people can get better, education and welfare, healthcare, all of that.
All right. How do you think these changes in the police need to be brought about?
Just simply being a human being, understanding everyone's human. Maybe take a test where the police have to assess a certain situation and act accordingly.
I'd really want like higher background checks about mental illnesses for cops and stuff. There's so much that can be done, especially like regarding that. Like there's just so much that could be done, but it's kind of hard to filter out, you know? Yeah.
I think there needs to be change within the police unions so that corrupt and racist officers can be fired.
I honestly think starting local is the easiest way, just because it's so difficult to get anything through Congress that will actually be enforced everywhere, especially when it comes to police, which are not controlled by the federal level. That would be the National Guard. And I personally think that starting small and local in your community is the best way to go about bringing change, because you have more control over it. So if people, as we've already seen, change is starting. Minneapolis is taking down their police force and reevaluating it to make it more specialized, and they're doing that all over in other cities and states as well, and I think that that's really the best process.
You know, I haven't really seen a lot of news when it comes to this, but you know, COVID-19 is still definitely a particularly hot button issue when it comes to the modern world. A lot of the world's leaders have cautioned protesters in the ways how they do their things. I think 99% of the people who are there are wearing masks and having the correct materials when it comes to washing their hands and stuff. The social distancing thing, though, yeah, I mean, this is a consequence of having a protest, is that you can't adequately social distance. Fortunately, though, in a lot of states that have really big protests, like New York, California, and some of the other bigger states, their rates of infection and their numbers have actually gone down. So, I guess that's good. But I think, I mean, COVID-19 definitely played a huge role when it comes to people congregating in these type of events. I'm not opposed to them completely, but I just think people should be safe.
I think COVID-19 is keeping a lot of people home. I know particularly my family is pretty willful in keeping me and my brother home so as not to spread the virus. I think some people are doing their part by wearing masks and trying to stay apart, but protests they're akin to, concerts and large mass gatherings. Not in that concerts are not protests. That's not what I mean to say, but large gatherings, it's not good for the spread of coronavirus. And as a rising senior, I definitely want to be able to go back to school and to go outside my community and do all the things I normally do. And so if we help catalyze that by getting people out and in contact with each other, then that's not helpful with reducing the spread.
I think how do I think these changes need to be brought about? I think what we can do as citizens is vote. That's probably the most important thing, but we can also push lawmakers to, like think a little bit and get stuff done. Uh, so I mean, protesting is super great to make our voices heard so that lawmakers can understand what we want, signing petitions. And I mean, we can, like, the only way this is going to change is with a change in the law, so it depends on who we elect to Congress and local elections.
All right.
Just the amount of force and discriminatory nature, we have to realize that all of us are human, and even though we may have committed a murder or a crime, we still need to understand that we're human. We should only use a necessary amount of force needed and let the court decide whether or not they decide what punishment they get.
Protesting, yeah, on the streets, that's perfectly fine. You can go to the top of the police chain in your city. There's so much you can do. You can go to, I don't know, the very top. It's just a matter of who would listen,
I think that by outlawing unions, this will help corrupt and racist officers to be fired.
I believe that these protests are necessary because they're raising so much awareness and they're actually making a difference. While people have tried kneeling or silently asking for a change, it's not really getting anywhere. And right now, with all of the momentum that this movement has, it's getting so much support and change is happening. People are noticing. By going out every weekend and standing on the sidewalk and asking for change and calling our legislators and reaching out to our leaders, we are making differences. We shouldn't be signing petitions in order to get murderers convicted. That should be something automatically that should be something that automatically happens. So I think that these protests are actually doing something, and we shouldn't stop until all of the change that we desire has happened. Until the steps are in place for change and action is being taken, these protests will continue to happen. And I support it 100%.
Like I said before, these protests are 100% justified. People are tired and angry and unappreciated with our elected officials that are in office, the status quo. They're tired. They're relentlessly tired of seeing the same shit happen to them all the time. Like I said, I'm tired too. I'm tired of seeing these people put down by our own nation, because that is not what our nation, pledged to build itself upon. Unfortunately, we haven't, fucking learned that. After 400 years.
And how do I feel about the protests? Generally positive. I think the protests, again, are a great way to bring attention to very serious issues, and everyone has the right to protest what they want and when they want. Not always where. There are certain places you can't protest. But, I mean, generally, if I had more protests around me, I would definitely attend them. Seattle's a bit of a drive for me, and I'm definitely staying home a bit more due to the corona, and so I'm not quite getting out there in the way that I would like to, but I think that these protests are absolutely a good thing, and I support them 100%.
How and why do you think these protests are necessary?
How and why do I think these protests are necessary? Well, I think they're necessary because because like this is an issue that's been going on for so long. It's crazy to me that it didn't. Well, of course it started sooner, but it's crazy to me that we haven't seen it in such a long time. Like since the 90s, I haven't heard of riots as big as these for like police brutality or something like that. So it's obviously necessary for there to be more protests. Yeah, I don't know. That's it.
These protests are an attempt to bring up change, whether it's the amount of force or the police should have, or what. In the case that I'm seeing mostly, the George Floyd murderers, the police who were there for his death, to be charged. As of today, they are arrested, and this was largely helped by the protest.
I mean, to get attention, it's such a real thing and it's so sad and it happens all the time. So bringing attention to what's happening is so important to do.
I think it brings up the conversation of racism and sparks change. Because if you're not like affected by racism, then you might not think that it's happening.
The media is only covering rioting and looting. They are not covering the peaceful protesting. In case people have not been watching the news or reading articles lately, the coverage of the protests have dropped significantly because the majority of them are peaceful. I think that what these people are doing in protests are so inspiring and empowering, and the fact that so many people are coming together and real change is happening as a result is amazing, and it shows that we make a difference. It shows that each individual person plays a role in their community and can actually make a difference in changing the world. While there are people who are resorting to violence and committing crimes during these protests, that's not the majority. That's not what we should be focusing on. It's terrible. It shouldn't be happening. But the people who are truly wanting to make a difference and wanting to make change are the ones who are there every week with the signs or walking down the streets and actually actively engaging. It's not the ones who the media are highlighting who are destroying communities. And I think that we should focus on those who are doing good.
I think these protests will 100% change the future of the United States. 100%. And it's really made me realize that I really need to get into these forms of, activism, not performance activism, but real activism. Going out to events, collaborating with people, filming them so they can be documented out to the world, so I can make, projects that people can see what's happening, the immense social progress that we're having. So this will 100% change the United States completely. And even if you don't agree that racism exists, at least you've been surrounded by what's happening, so it's in your head that people are tired.
How do I think? Okay. Sorry. I think that this generation is more vocal than any previous generation. I think that's been increased dramatically due to the rise of social media, because I believe we've been given more access to get our voices and opinions out there from an early age, and we've also been taught that our opinions matter, but also that we need to be more forceful in getting our opinions out there. I think this generation doesn't like to be marginalized, and I think I don't want to say other generations don't care, but I think Gen Z has hit kind of a breaking point with a lot of issues. I mean, we've grown up seeing, race riots or protests, race riots, protests. I mean, 2014, we had huge ones in Ferguson, and again this year, and then, every year in between, there's been huge catalyzing events and more instances of police brutality. Same thing with gun violence in American school systems. I mean, we have the most mass shootings of any country by far, and that's led to huge, student-wide protests that contribute to that movement. But yeah, I think this generation's been way more vocal, and I think the way that everyone's getting involved, I know a lot of my friends have been chalking sidewalks and drawing in windows, that kind of thing, of local businesses. I think this will definitely cause people to consider where they stand on a lot of important issues, and I know it's caused me and a lot of my friends to examine their privilege, especially as a lot of white friends. So race definitely comes into play, but also as someone who's been afforded a pretty fortunate lifestyle. I mean, definitely middle class privilege, privilege that comes with living in not a city where there's as much like police action. Either argue whether it's required or not, there just simply is more police action in certain cities. So I think that will definitely affect us.
Well, that's a really okay. So do I think what people are doing in these protests is a good thing? For the most part, yeah. And in my opinion, even when it comes to looting, well, not looting. In my opinion, even when it comes to rioting to some extent, I don't think it's okay, but I think it's justified. I mean, people want to talk about not about like how do I say this? About like having peaceful protests and not having violence in protests, but the truth is there's so much built up anger. Like this has been going on since the beginning of the country, and it's incredibly understandable to me that someone wants to graffiti a wall or like throw a rock at someone. And I mean that does escalate a conflict, but it's like I can understand it perfectly. As for like marching peacefully, I think it's amazing. It's really inspiring to see. And looting, I mean, in these cases, there will always be people that try to take advantage of these situations, and I mean, you can't really help it. But I guess that's not okay. But again, I completely understand why it happens, and it's justified.
I believe the protests at its heart is a good thing, but again, there are just random people who would go see these protests and take advantage to riot.
Rioting, not so much, but protesting on the street, of course, wearing masks and stuff. Yeah, I think it's a good thing.
I think that the peaceful protests are amazing and they're bringing awareness to this country.
These protests during the midst of a pandemic is difficult. It's different than normal because people are wearing masks and trying to keep their distance, and I think that everyone who attends the protests are aware of the risks that they're taking, but they should also be extra cautious because they are putting other people's lives at risk. And I believe that getting tested is a good idea. I myself am trying to get tested currently. I think that if people are more at risk or are showing certain symptoms, they should not go to the protests. But everybody who attends should know the potential risks and hopefully are taking all of the steps necessary to protect themselves and other people while still being able to raise their voice and share their opinion.
I have 100% seen racism in the environment in Coronado. 100%. Maybe not to the fullest extent of, killing a unarmed black man, but I have seen racial comments within our school, people calling, others the N-word for no reason. I've seen racial profiling. I've seen people, I've heard people that have been unjustly pulled over by the police for no reason because they were a minority. I've seen this shit happen in Coronado, in our community. And, when it comes to Coronado, we're a pretty mixed bag when it comes to political views, but we're mostly Republican, okay? Not saying all the Republicans are racist, but you get the point. I have seen this type of, this blatant racial profiling when it comes to people in Coronado. And I don't want to call specific people out, but you know who you are.
Okay, so so how have I seen racism in my environment around you, both your school and in your community? In this specific community, I've moved around a lot as a kid, and so I've been in a lot of communities over the years. But this community particularly, I don't see a lot of racism. However, I live in a pretty homogenous town. I would say most of the people I come into contact with are white or are mixed people. We don't have a lot of racism, but there's not really anything to it's difficult to explain, but there's less conflict, but it's not necessarily because of citizens' actions, it's just because the society is mostly white. That being said, though, I've seen a huge push for equality in our schools. Our student school board has made it a huge deal to fight for equity in our school environment and make sure all races feel like they are represented in the school system and their voices are being heard. We also see that same thing with poverty levels and that kind of thing, making sure there's equal access to laptops and to goods and to getting to school, and there's free and reduced lunch meals, that kind of thing, to make sure that there's not such a huge gap in race and in income status.
How do I think COVID-19 is affecting the protests? Well, I think if COVID-19 weren't here, the protests would be bigger. Like, there would definitely be more of like a bigger turnout for the protests. And I mean, I've gone to a couple of protests and you see everyone wearing masks. And I guess if you're gonna get into like a violent situation, it's good that you already have your mask in case of like a tear gas event or something like that. So, I mean, definitely people have been more prepared for things to get violent. And that's, I think, partly due to COVID. So,
All right. How do you personally feel about the protests?
again, like, how do I personally feel about the protest? I think it's amazing. It's like super, I mean, I think it's great that everyone is, well, that most people are coming together and like having their voices heard. I think the protests still need more support right now, and especially now that the movement kind of started dying down. But I mean, I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. I've seen it, I've studied about it in the past. You study about the civil rights movement, and seeing something so similar happening right before your eyes is amazing. Like, it brings me so much amazement. I think it's so cool.
COVID-19, from the footage I've seen on the news, isn't affecting it much, but again, we are in a quarantine, so I think we're going to see a large spike in COVID-19 cases unless people try to take the proper precautions.
Well, COVID is COVID was bad a little bit ago, but I mean, if the person going to the protest wants to risk that, then I'm okay with that.
I think there's a lot of criticism because people who believe there needs to be social distancing might think that the timing of these protests are bad because it could spread COVID 19.
I personally think that protests are important and necessary, and they're making a difference. We've seen change happen because of them. And I think that if it's. I think that if these are actually. I think that if these protests are raising awareness and making change in your community, why stop?
I think racism, just as a concept as a whole, will, 100% never go away. There will always feel people that feel like they should be taking out on others and dumbing them down because of their color of their skin. It's just a matter of the fact. But I think there's a difference between getting rid of racism and getting rid of prejudice, because prejudice can be built upon institutions. Racism can be built upon institutions, but prejudice can be taken out of those institutions. And, I think you can combat this by not just posting one thing on your social media, not just posting a quote by someone, not just donating to one donation. You have to constantly be educating yourself when it comes to these systematic problems that we've had with racism in this country for years and years and years and years and years, and it still continues to happen. You need to educate yourself. That is the easiest thing that you can do to combat your own, little racist ideologies in general. Even myself, I was not so educated on specific other issues until now. I've been constantly reading, books, articles, watching movies about black culture, black history, everything. You need to educate yourself. That is the first thing you can do. Second thing, talk to people. Talk to people of color. Not willingly, just like, hey, I want to learn about your issues even though I don't know about you. If you know somebody who's a person of color, especially African American, just talk to them about their experiences. Just talk to them. Because knowing that somebody close to you, like a black neighbor, who you see every single day but may not know everything about your life, you have a conversation with them about how they've been treated in this world, you'll 100% figure out that they have not been treated the same as you. And I'm saying this as a white person.
So, let's see. What can people do to combat racism? So, the first thing I would say is educate yourself. There's tons of great resources online that help you, understand your privilege. If you are white, or I'm sorry, my phone went off for a second. So educate yourself. The number one thing, the thing that I've been doing is signing petitions, which are super helpful. You can talk to your local congressmen or women, your state senators. I mean, every state has two, and you can contact them. A huge thing to contact is your district attorney, and when you're 18, register to vote. And that way you can vote people out of power that don't stand for your ideals and have a policy that hasn't really been equal across races or income statuses, that kind of thing. District attorneys don't have term limits. So some of these people have been in office for a very long time, and they're keeping their outdated opinions in there with them. So when you're 18, register to vote, 100%. Besides educating yourself, signing petitions, and registering to vote, I think protests, again, are one of the best ways. Being on social media. Now, I know there's some issues with like being kind of silent on social media. Not everyone is posting, and sometimes posting like one or two things. They think, oh, I'm done with the issue. There's no need to go further with this. And that's not the case. So social media is kind of a tricky one, but I think it can definitely be a positive platform for change and that kind of thing.
How do I think this movement will change the future of the United States and my life as a student? I think my life as a student, I don't think it will change drastically, because unfortunately these things take time, and I mean this is a huge point in history, and like it's definitely going to be a turning point, but still I don't see many changes happening in education, well, at least for me, because like I know in Coronado something's going to happen. Like um I know people will start to hear us in Coronado, but I'm going to college. So, I mean, as a student, it's not really going to affect me that much. But the United States as a whole, I think will. I mean, just look around. Like police are starting to be defunded, and that's thanks to the protest and thanks to the everything, all of the petitions that have been signed. New laws are being created, like the Breonna Taylor law. I think that's incredible. Like, yeah, justice is like slowly rolling itself out, but it's gonna take a little more time and definitely a lot more effort.
Glad people are willing to protest and make a change. And there's been some protesting down at downtown, but at the same time, it's disappointing to know that the riots are everywhere. They're like, if there's a protest, there's bound to be a riot caused by someone.
I'm all for it. They're standing up for something, and they want to bring attention to it, so I fully support their protest. They can protest about anything they want. Yeah.
Once again, I think that these peaceful protests are amazing because they're bringing necessary awareness and change.
I think that these protests are showing the younger generations that when you put your mind to something and you actually act on it, you can make a difference and you can spark change. And personally, I find it inspiring. I'm empowered. That's why I'm out there doing my own protests and marches with my community. And as students, as a student, I've been able to make a difference. I've seen single-handedly my community come together to fight for equality and more police training and reevaluation of our system, and it's so empowering. And I think that it's something that the students in my community will carry on the rest of our lives, that knowledge that we can make a difference.
You can also spread activism when it comes to media. So, like I said, you can create certain projects, you can create certain films, you can educate people in that way. When it comes to photography, you can donate to Black-owned businesses, you can donate to Black artists, you can donate to all these sort of things. But the most important thing is to vote. And I know this argument gets put up in so many, arguments saying, oh, voting won't really do anything because the institutions don't listen to us. But no. If you build a consensus of voters that say we need to stop systematic racism in this country, I bet you a lot of things would change in time if you had a very large coalition of voting.
other students to do to help combat racism. Again, educate themselves and look at how their privilege affects them and how it affects other people around them, and what they can do to try to level the playing field and respect people of all races and income status and genders and any other major group labels I'm missing. Yeah, just make sure you're educating yourself on that issue.
Wow. Yeah. Like, well, in Coronado, there's a lot of racism. Well, I can see it. It's really visible, because it's like, it's not even hitting here. It's really in front of you. Well, I mean, you go to school here in Coronado High School, I hear racial slurs every single day, and not only towards black people, definitely, like, I've heard racial slurs for like Latinos and Mexicans specifically, and gay people. I mean, I guess that's not a racial slur, but LGBTQ plus people, and teachers teachers kind of forget to teach us about Black history at Coronado High, let alone any other culture that lives in the United States. They forget to teach us all of that. And Coronado, I mean, I haven't seen any specific instances. Like, I mean, sometimes it's not racism, but, you know, I'll be speaking in Spanish with my mom, whatever, at the grocery store or whatever. You definitely get some like really mean looks and stuff, you know. This community is just so sheltered that whenever something out of the ordinary happens, especially if it like involves race, people will freak out. Like, just look at the protests. Like, while we were doing the protests, we got so much opposition. Someone spit at me in the first protest I went to. Someone spit at me. And like, yeah, things like that. I mean, I haven't been here for too long. I've been here for 2 years and I've seen it. I can't even imagine what someone else who might be African American and has lived here like their whole life has gone through here. It's crazy.
All right. How do you think these protests and the changes they'll bring about will affect the future of the United States and your life as a student?
Well, I only see three outcomes to this. Either massive spike in coronavirus cases causing causing an increase in the death rate, the country falling into anarchy with all the chaos going on, or somehow we bring about change and the amount of tragedies we have in the US is reduced.
There's already, I mean, 2020 is really something different. So this will really go down in history. So I feel like the year 2020 in general will just be it'll be a history lesson. Like, it's been crazy. So it'll definitely affect the future. And as a student, it's compromised my learning for sure, but I guess we're figuring it out. So yeah.
I think by hearing all these stories of people at CHS who have been affected by racism really opened my eyes, and I think that this will allow for future CHS students to be an upstander when things happen in the future.
I've grown up in a predominantly white community, so it's been difficult for us to understand that some of our teachings and thoughts and mindsets that we have are racist, just because we haven't had people tell us that they are, and we haven't researched or educated ourselves in that way. And I personally feel guilty for not educating myself previously. It's only been recently that I've realized some of the things that I do or experienced, or some of the things that I've experienced that are a privilege for me, being partially white. However, I am part Hispanic, and that has affected me a little bit, being in a super white community, just because growing up I didn't really want to mention that I was part Hispanic, and I was sort of ashamed of that culture because I felt like I wouldn't be as accepted, which was weird because I was an elementary schooler and was ashamed of part of my heritage. I don't think that's right. I'm not sure I'm not sure I can recall specific acts of racism that I've experienced. But I know that there are things that my family has experienced and things that I've seen other people experience, and it's got.
I have 100% seen racism in the environment in Coronado. 100%. Maybe not to the fullest extent of, killing a unarmed black man, but I have seen racial comments within our school, people calling, others the N-word for no reason. I've seen racial profiling, I've seen people, I've heard people that have been unjustly pulled over by the police for no reason because they were a minority. I've seen this shit happen in Coronado, in our community. And, when it comes to Coronado, we're a pretty mixed bag when it comes to political views, but we're mostly Republican, okay? Not saying all the Republicans are racist, but you get the point. I have seen this type of, this blatant racial profiling when it comes to people in Coronado. And I don't want to call specific people out, but you know who you are.
In this specific community, I've moved around a lot as a kid, and so I've been in a lot of communities over the years. But this community particularly, I don't see a lot of racism. However, I live in a pretty homogenous town. I would say most of the people I come into contact with are white or aren't or are mixed people. We don't have a lot of racism, but there's not really anything to. It's difficult to explain, but there's less conflict, but it's not necessarily because of citizens' actions. It's just because the society is mostly white. That being said, though, I've seen a huge push for equality in our schools. Our student school board has made it a huge deal to fight for equity in our school environment and make sure all races feel like they are represented in the school system and their voices are being heard. We also see that same thing with poverty levels and that kind of thing, making sure there's equal access to laptops and to goods and to getting to school, and there's free and reduced lunch meals, that kind of thing, to make sure that there's not such a huge gap in race and in income status. So let's see.
Yeah. Like, well, in Coronado, there's a lot of racism. Well, I can see it. It's really, really visible because it's like it's not even hitting here. It's really in front of you. Well, I mean, you go to school here in Coronado High School. I hear racial slurs every single day, and not only towards Black people. Definitely, like, I've heard racial slurs for like Latinos and Mexicans specifically, and gay people. I mean, I guess that's not a racial slur, but LGBTQ plus people, and teachers have like teachers kind of forget to teach us about Black history at Coronado High, let alone any other culture that lives in the United States. They forget to teach us all of that. And Coronado, I mean, I haven't seen any specific instances. Like, I mean, sometimes it's not racism, but you know, I'll be speaking in Spanish with my mom, whatever, at the grocery store or whatever. You definitely get some like really mean looks and stuff, you know. This community is just so sheltered that whenever something out of the ordinary happens, like especially if it like involves race, people will freak out. Like, just look at the protests. Like, while we were doing the protests, we got so much opposition. Someone spit at me in the first protest I went to. Someone spit at me. And like, yeah, things like that. I mean, I haven't been here for too long. I've been here for 2 years and I've seen it. I can't even imagine what someone else who might be African American and has lived here like their whole life has gone through here. It's crazy.
There hasn't been much racism in my community except for the occasional coronavirus Asian joke. So the one where one of us Asians sneeze or cough and someone jumps up and jokes, "Oh shit, the coronavirus."
Okay. What do you think people can do to combat racism?
Just remember that we're all human beings, no matter what race or color we are. We are human. We have feelings, we're still mortal, we still have lives to live. It's times like this where we forget it or choose to ignore it.
Where I live, there's only 1% African American population in the school. So there's not a lot. So I feel like it's definitely there. A lot of my friends have had racial experiences, and with the cops, there are definitely some racial problems going on there. And yeah, it's a very Caucasian community, but I'm not saying all of them are bad, because a lot of them aren't. Most of them aren't, but there's definitely some racial stuff going on.
Well, I live a block away from the house on 4th that has illustrations of the historical racial injustices in this town.
Really, just educating yourself is the first step, and it's not just the first step, it's something that you should continue on your entire life. It's something you should make a habit. I need to continue educating myself. I need to continue reading books, watching films, listening to podcasts, just trying to inform myself of all of the injustices and all of the truths that I've been sheltered from my entire life. And I think that that's a great way to start, by reading articles, by watching shows. And it's a good way to continue on.
I think racism, just as a concept as a whole, will, 100% never go away. There will always feel people that feel like they should be taking out on others and dumbing them down because of their color of their skin. It's just a matter of the fact. But I think there's a difference between getting rid of racism and getting rid of prejudice, because prejudice can be built upon institutions. Racism can be built upon institutions, but prejudice can be taken out of those institutions. And I think you can combat this by not just posting one thing on your social media, not just posting a quote by someone, not just donating to one donation. You have to constantly be educating yourself when it comes to these systematic problems that we've had with racism in this country for years and years and years and years and years, and it still continues to happen. You need to educate yourself. That is the easiest thing that you can do to combat your own, little racist ideologies in general. Even myself, I was not so educated on specific other issues until now. I've been constantly reading books, articles, watching movies about black culture, black history, everything. You need to educate yourself. That is the first thing you can do. Second thing, talk to people. Talk to people of color. Not willingly, just like, hey, I want to learn about your issues even though I don't know about you. If you know somebody who's a person of color, especially African American, just talk to them about their experiences. Just talk to them. Because knowing that somebody close to you, like a black neighbor, who you see every single day but may not know everything about your life, you have a conversation with them about how they've been treated in this world, you will 100% figure out that they have not been treated the same as you. And I'm saying this as a white person. You can also spread activism when it comes to media. So, like I said, you can create certain projects, you can create certain films, you can educate people in that way when it comes to photography. You can donate to black-owned businesses, you can donate to black artists, you can donate to all these sort of things. But the most important thing is to vote. And I know this argument gets put up in so many, arguments saying, voting won't really do anything because the institutions don't listen to us. But no. If you build a consensus of voters that say we need to stop systematic racism in this country, I bet you a lot of things would change in time if you had a very large coalition of voting.
In this specific community, I've moved around a lot as a kid, and so I've been in a lot of communities over the years. But this community particularly, I don't see a lot of racism. However, I live in a pretty homogenous town. I would say most of the people I come into contact with are white or aren't or are mixed people. We don't have a lot of racism, but there's not really anything to it's difficult to explain, but there's less conflict, but it's not necessarily because of citizens' actions, it's just because the society is mostly white. That being said, though, I've seen a huge push for equality in our schools. Our student school board has made it a huge deal to fight for equity in our school environment and make sure all races feel like they are represented in the school system and their voices are being heard. We also see that same thing with poverty levels and that kind of thing, making sure there's equal access to laptops and to goods and to getting to school, and there's free and reduced lunch meals, that kind of thing, to make sure that there's not such a huge gap in race and in income status.
There's a lot of things. For me, like, my number one is protest, because I feel like I have a strong voice that I can put out. But that can be anywhere on your list, The big one I would say is vote. It's the fastest way to combat racism. If you wanna get something like to change the system, vote. Next, I would obviously you can sign petitions. Donating is super, super, super important. And I think the most basic one is just to talk about it and stop making it such a big deal, just make it part of your daily conversation to talk about racism with someone, because the more everyone's informed, the more like the faster we can get past this issue, like having conversations. I think it's just the most basic important thing that we can do to combat this.
Just remember that we're all human beings, no matter what race or color we are. We are human. We have feelings, we're still mortal, we still have lives to live. It's times like this where we forget it or choose to ignore it. Just try to be the example of how we should act. Like, how do I best explain this? We just need to treat others like human beings, recognize everyone is human, and we can't just stand by seeing that someone needs help and do nothing. In the case of the George Floyd murderers, a police officer stood there and did nothing. If we see something like that, we should at least try to help.
It's so hard because I just don't even understand why someone would think that way, because it's just the color of someone's skin. Like, it's terrible. It's 2020. People really shouldn't be thinking that way. So I just feel like it's up to the future to raise their kids with no racial profiling, anything like that. And we can try our best now, but there's some people that just won't listen, and it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. We can help others who have had racial experiences speak out about their experiences, go to the protests and, talk about the experiences, spread the word. It's terrible.
I think by being an upstander and not a bystander, and if you see something, say something.
First of all, believe the officers who killed Breonna Taylor need to be fired, need to be arrested and convicted. That's... Sorry. I don't understand why they haven't been convicted already. And I can't even imagine how her family's feeling. It's been months. That's not right. It's not just the police officers who need to be reevaluated. It's the health professionals who refuse to give certain treatments to BIPOC or perform operations to the degree that they should be performed. It's the judges who rule in favor of the obviously guilty criminal, or the judges who rule against BIPOC unfairly. It's everywhere. Systemic racism is so evident, and it's not systematic. It's systemic. It's a problem that has been happening for decades, for centuries, and we still haven't fixed it because it's rooted in our upbringing. We need to start looking at how we can reteach anti-racism from a young age and let that carry on into occupations and into higher level education.
On the social level, we just need to be more aware. Like I said, educate yourself. Talk to your friends who are, people of color or Black, Latino, Native American. See their experiences that they've had in their life. Talk with your grandparents who may seem a little bit racist. Educate them as well. Because even though they may not listen to all of your talking points and rhetoric, at least they have a framework in their minds that you actually care about the problem, and you're educating them into, seeing a little bit about the issue. I think on the justice level, We need to totally reform our entire police system. So that comes to banning certain things like tear gas, banning certain things like rubber bullets, banning certain things like flak grenades when it comes to putting things at protesters, demilitarize the police, ban private prisons, and qualified immunity, make police officers held accountable, put them in a very long training program that's 1 to 2 years of training, but also let them have education into the matter of law enforcement before. It is required in some countries that you have a college education to be a public service officer. That should be a requirement in this country. Reform the justice system completely, because it has been systematically racist at its core since the beginning of the foundation of this country. Ratify the 13th Amendment that says that making mass incarceration of certain individuals is legalized. But most importantly, like I said, just fucking vote. Just vote to take out these institutions. Vote to reform. Vote to get progressive change.
I think on the justice level, nationwide, I think there's a major issue with African American incarceration being at a higher percentage than white incarceration, sometimes for the same crimes. And I think that's inherent bias in the police system. I mean, it's systemic, and that definitely needs to change. I'm not sure if I have solvency for the issue, but I mean, it needs to be addressed. I think one of the other solutions is, again, more people trained in de-escalation for conflicts to limit the need of police in certain situations where they aren't necessary and only escalate the situation. I think that's all the solvency I really have on that issue. If I had all the answers, I'd hope I'd be in charge, but I am still in high school, and I just know that this is a major issue, but I'm not sure if I have all of the steps to get to where we need to go on my own. It's a group issue that needs lots of people to sit down at a table with a large amount of Black people and people of other races coming together and sharing their ideas on how to reform this criminal justice system and how to reform this, social inequalities that have come with it.
Well, number one is defunding the police. That's basic. And moving the crucial part of defunding the police is moving all of those funds towards things that need it, like welfare, public housing, education, drug addiction centers, homeless shelters, all of that. That's, I think, the first step, the most important one, and the one that we've seen happening so far. So I think that's great. That's just to solve the issue of police brutality, to make society just less racist. I'm not sure.
That's a really hard question. I haven't really thought about it, but I just feel like there's so much we can do as the future. We are the future, our age. So there's so much we can do and we can try to do.
My family and I have butted heads quite a bit on the current situation and our opinions on it. My mother doesn't believe systemic racism is an actual thing, and I think that truly shows how strong white privilege is and how difficult it is to start educating yourself on the truth of the matter. The fact that people don't understand the severity of this issue and the fact that racism goes beyond what's on the surface is frightening, and it means that there's a real problem and we need to address it as soon as we possibly can.
My family has talked about our individual views, and we 100% pretty much all agree that we should be standing in solidarity. We may have some differing issues when it comes to policy changes, but we 100% agree that these protests are justified, they should be completely still going, and that systematic change needs to happen.
So me and my family are pretty vocal on the issues going on. I would say that I have opposing opinions to a few of my family members, and a few of my family members agree with me on certain issues. I think it's good to have differing opinions, but sometimes it's frustrating that you feel like you're not being heard, which I think is it's almost a small experiment for what's going on nationwide. I think a lot of people feel they aren't being heard, even with the protests. And I think that that's dangerous. When people feel like they aren't being heard, sometimes they speak louder, and sometimes that means grabbing attention in not necessarily safe ways. I mean, we've seen that with the looting and riots that happen sometimes. People feel like they aren't being heard, and they think that's the way to be heard, which it's sad to say, but sometimes that is how people are being heard. And that's not necessarily a positive reinforcement.
Have me and my family members talked about all of this and our views? Yeah, we have quite a lot, definitely.
Yes, actually. I'm in a racially mixed family, so we're pretty much all on the same page, so yeah.
Yes, I discussed this horrible, horrible racism that is going on in our country with my family. We had a very long talk about not only our town's racism, but this country's racism.
I think that while these conversations are uncomfortable, and while looking within yourself to see where you've made mistakes is difficult, it's so necessary. It starts with you. All you need to do is read a book or read a simple article, watch a movie, listen to a podcast while you're cleaning, and learn. And be open to learning and changing your mindset when you hear new information. And listen. Listen to those who say that they've experienced injustice. Listen to those who are asking for help. That's the first step, is being open to wanting to hear about what needs to be changed. From there, you can go on to educate yourself and actually create action. But I would say listening is the most important and the first thing you should do if you want to make a difference.
I'd like to end with this. As a person with privilege, I'm happy that I get to go on here and talk about all of these things and have this expensive camera and lights and everything to, educate, people who are watching this video into the manner, because it's important that you use that privilege, because many don't even have the privilege to stand up and talk about this. Many are just stuck in their communities with no, running water, no, food on the table. They have bills to be paid. They can't get a phone. They can't get a camera. They can't get all this stuff. Their voices can't be heard because they're systematically put down by the systems of this country. So use your privilege to stand out. Use your privilege to stand up.